Welcome everyone to the third in-person meeting in Montreal. We'd first like to recognize that we're in Kaneohe territory. We're having this panel discussion today to talk about reconciliation. For the past couple of days, we've actually talked about reconciliation and how to move forward together and improving the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people.
Bonjour tout le monde, merci beaucoup.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much to attend. First of all, I would like to recognize that we are on the traditional territory of Kani. It's our third meeting in person with the Prime Minister and ministers. Over the last 3 days, we had a very important discussion on reconciliation and how we can work together, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people of the country. And now I will give the floor to.
What a pleasure to see everyone together here today. This is the third time that the Youth Council has gathered together, and this time, we have been talking about reconciliation. We've had fantastic, deep discussions, extremely illuminating.
Is the backgrounds, the perspectives that are gathered around here representing young people from every corner of the country, all sorts of different backgrounds that are coming together around similar themes about how we make Canada better, how we build a better future. And this entire session, these past days, have been focused on reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, what that means, what the path forward looks like. And I had the extraordinary pleasure of watching them challenge some of my best ministers with really difficult questions and pertinent suggestions about how we can do better. Il y a tellement de travail à faire, on le sait, et c'est pas juste une question de gouvernement.
There's so much work to do. It's not a question of the government and Indigenous peoples. It's up to all Canadians. We all have a role to play. We have to talk about education, values, learning, respect, and that is what we heard this week. I look forward to hearing the questions that we'll be hearing this evening for panels and for all Canadians.
Okay, so to start it off, the first question I have for you, Minister Joly, is, as we all know, this year we're celebrating Canada 150, and when talking about reconciliation, there are a lot of Indigenous people that have a lot of issues with Canada 150 and don't feel right celebrating Canada 150, and there's things like, you know, Resistance 150 and Colonialism 150, and how would you address that as the Minister of Heritage, and what would you like to say about that?
Thanks, Riley, for the question. Of course, in the context of Canada 150, what we're doing is we're highlighting 4 themes: the importance of youth, diversity, the environment, and reconciliation with Indigenous people. Because we want to make sure that all Canadians are able to celebrate while also reflecting on their past, allowing different versions of our history to be able to be presented and actually to be part of these discussions. The Prime Minister just referred to it. It is important that Canadians be educated and be taught different things that happened in our past, in the past 150 years. And we very much know that the history between Indigenous and non-Indigenous is far from perfect over the past 150 years, and that's exactly what we want to do. We want to do the next 150 years way better than the past 150 years. And in this context, that's why we are investing in different projects to make sure that people from across the country will know what reconciliation is about, what young Indigenous leaders are talking about, and what they want to tell non-Indigenous people. So this is why it's so important, and this is why it's such an important moment in our history, and we're really tackling this issue. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Riley, and your fabulous comments, Minister Joly. I really hope that's a common thread throughout our conversation the next 150 years. Firstly, some housekeeping notes. So if you haven't grabbed your popcorn, it's too late. It's time to sit down and engage with us. We, my fellow councillors and I, we have the opportunity to speak with these people on your behalf regularly, but it's your chance to engage with us via Facebook Live. So I really hope you take the time to add some comments, some meaningful comments, some questions that you're dying to ask, because this is your chance to get your answers. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to someone at my table in front of me before I get to Facebook. You need some time to percolate and ponder some questions. I know Neha grabbed me earlier on, one of our fellow councillors, and you have a question you'd like to ask the panel. Please go ahead.
Yes, of course. I was just wondering if we could open up the discussion that we haven't quite had yet, which is how do non-Indigenous but also non-white Canadians find themselves, where do they find themselves in the conversation of reconciliation? Speaking to some of the young leaders in Kahnawake yesterday, one of the experiences that I deeply related to were their incredible experiences of racism. And I just want to know where we fit into this conversation and where you see this relationship of allyship going further. Thank you.
Well, I think to kick it off, you've all heard me say this before, one of the great strengths of our country is we figured out how to make our differences a source of strength and resilience for ourselves and our communities, not a source of division as much as possible. And learning from each other, sharing our stories, whether our people have been in this land for millennia or whether they arrived a few hundred years ago or a few years ago. The challenges that we face in trying to build a better future for ourselves, for our neighbors, for future generations is a shared one. And learning from each other, learning the stories, learning the terrible mistakes of the past, but staying focused on how we can fix with our present actions, with our future trends, the mistakes of the past while drawing on better opportunities for everyone in the future is going to be really, really important. So I think there's a role for everyone to recognize that Canada is a country we are constantly building together, recognizing the errors, recognizing the good things, learning together and building forward in a way that is open to everyone participating is, I think, at the center of it. There's certainly some people who will feel less wrapped up in different aspects of our history. If you're a new Canadian learning about the terrible colonialism of our past that may or may not echo colonialism that you had to go through or your parents or grandparents had to go through in their previous countries, but all these stories and our learning and our moving forward can only happen if we're having open, honest, trust-based conversations with each other. And I think that's what this milestone of 150 is bringing us to do.
Anyone else like to field that question?
Riley.
Okay.
We'll take another shot at this one and we'll move on.
I think that when you're talking about racism, and I'm thinking back to what we said yesterday, or what we talked about yesterday when we were talking to Jason Madden, something that you can do, because this question was asked then too, and how can we work together as Indigenous and non-Indigenous people to stop things like this, is he said to call it out in the same way that you would call out sexism, or in the same way that you'd call out misogyny or any sort of injustice. If you see someone saying something, like, that's the first step to being an ally, right, is to see something that's wrong and address it, and that becomes the norm, that having these perceptions about people is wrong. And I think that if we can instill that in people and in Canadian society, then that's a great first step at kind of bridging that gap.
Et je pense aussi un autre aspect qui est intéressant. Mon collègue ministre de l'Immigration.
What's also interesting is that the Minister of Education and myself are discussing the idea of which story needs to be presented when it comes to Canada 150. There are different symbols, different Canadian symbols, but also reconciliation and the Indigenous perspective. I think that the government and that Canada can do better to present that perspective, and that's what we're working on.
I'm getting a message here. It looks like we have a question from Facebook, so I'm going to take it over to Sylvia and Ryan.
It's more of a comment. Bonnie Musk said, "The youth will drive the reconciliation process, and it's exciting to see them having these discussions." Your thought?
So I suppose we could phrase that into, how best can we go about driving these discussions if it is left up to the youth to really put that push. Would anyone like to? Yes, Greg.
We met with Mike, who? Just Mike. We just met with Mike. And he said a statistic that 80% of young Canadians believe that reconciliation can be achieved within their lifetime. And that speaks a lot of words. The effects of residential schools and the history between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people is an intergenerational thing, and reconciliation will be an intergenerational thing. This is not going to be an easy fix, but the youth today can make those steps forward, and the youth tomorrow can continue to make those steps.
Une des choses qu'on reconnaît, c'est qu'il y a eu tellement de dégâts.
We also recognize that in the past, for generations, for centuries, there were huge mistakes that were made, huge harm that was done to Indigenous peoples, and it's going to take a long time to get back onto the right path. There are things that we can do immediately, improvements that we can bring today, but it's going to take several generations to work on this. And so today we need to give the youth the right tools. They need to be involved. They are essential for this project of reconciliation. They have to keep working on reconciliation during their entire lives, and that will be absolutely essential.
Is Max Fine Day. So from a co-director from Canadian Roots Exchange, which is dedicated, I'm putting a plug out for CRE, but to creating those relationships between non-Indigenous and Indigenous youth. And I think that really does touch on the question very well, because it's coming together that will move forward. But I do have another question from Facebook. So we're going to hand it over to you.
Cameron Linzinski asked, "What are you going to do to save our Indigenous languages as they are living and will die soon if not taught in schools and documented and revitalized?"
Thank you. This is a very important question. Last December, the Prime Minister announced that we would be launching and actually working on a first legislation to preserve and enhance Indigenous languages in her history. And we would be doing that along with Indigenous communities. And so this will be the first co-developed legislation in 150 years along with Indigenous people. And so this is a big project we're working on right now. It's not an easy one, but it is one that will have a lot of impact, and that we are really looking forward to make sure that Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people are on board in terms of reflecting and how can I say, supporting this important work and legislation. We have 90 languages and dialects in Canada. Some of them are not at the same state of preservation. And so it is important that we do that. The Prime Minister referred to the impacts of colonialism. We know that we have to move ahead on this important legislation to address the important wrongs that were done by the residential school system, and to enhance cultural security amongst our Indigenous colleagues and citizens.
I'd like to hear from some of the young people on the value of language, because we as a country can say, yes, it's important to protect and preserve Indigenous languages as part of our history, part of our present, part of our future. But as young people, what is the weight of Indigenous languages, and how do you feel about that?
Indigenous languages is almost just like is a part of culture, and for a lot of First Nation youth, that is something that they lack. And so if we can preserve these languages, we can preserve this culture for the kids of Indigenous children, or of people, so that generations down the road that they can still actually research this and actually understand where they have actually come from. It'll give them a sense of pride. It'll give them a sense of proudness of who they are and where they come from. Especially being an Indigenous person, you should be proud of who you are. You should be proud that you were resilient. You should be proud that you're still here in 2017 after all the history that has happened.
So I just think that when you value your language, you value your culture, like Greg said. It goes hand in hand. And so thank you for the steps you're taking to improve Indigenous languages in Canada. I think that's really, really important. And I just, in my ideal mind, I just picture a Canada where a kid just sees just as much, value in learning their own language as any other language, and that they feel that their culture has value. So,
Alex, tu es une francophone qui habite dans une province.
Alex, you're a francophone who lives in a province where francophones are in the minority. You've reflected at length on Indigenous languages also. Would you like to share your perspective? Yes, thank you. I'm really lucky. I live in a community in Yukon where there are lots of francophones, and francophonie is valued through the government, through jobs, through opportunities for youth. I have many First Nations friends, and language is really the primary thing, the primary aspect of a culture. I think it's something that changes in northern communities in the Yukon. I have a friend who developed an app to learn her language. And I have another friend who's teaching her dog how to speak Tlingit. So I don't really like dog sitting for her because it's hard to say sit in Tlingit. But there are many things that can be done and that are being done. Language is really the first step towards reconciliation, in my opinion.
Merci tout le monde.
Thank you, everyone. Since I'm also young, I might add a comment.
To meet with several youth from a reserve, a community not too far from here. And I was absolutely shocked to learn that universities don't actually, not all universities perhaps, but some don't recognize Indigenous languages as a language that can be used to enter in a program as a second language. I thought that was crazy. And I know with federal and provincial powers, like the jurisdictions and whatnot we can impose on universities, is a little complicated. So I have a mission for people watching. If you are a university student or you work in student politics, you can lobby your administration to change that. Go to your senates, your board of governors, and make that change, because by recognizing those languages, we can help them to live on and the culture won't die. Because I think we all agree from what I heard here, without your language, you lose your culture. It's the identity. I'm going to open up the floor again to a fellow councillor. So I'd be happy to take a question for the panel. Anyone? Yes, Gabe, please.
So what is one thing that a young Canadian, one of us, or someone watching on Facebook Live today could do to contribute to reconciliation?
First one, go visit an Indigenous community near you. Go to, if you live in a big city, go to an Indigenous Friendship Center. Try and find out directly how you can engage with what for far too many non-Indigenous Canadians is a community that they don't simply know unless it's through bad news or reports or movies. Meet an Indigenous Canadian and learn their story, understand their history. Choose to try and learn more. Take this year of thinking about our history, of marking a milestone, to learn more about the terrible past that we've had, and share part of the responsibility for making sure that we acknowledge, understand, and develop the tools to make sure that we are fixing the mistakes of the past.
Another idea is download the app Passport 2017. This is the app for Canada 150. You'll find out all the reconciliation projects in there, and you can have access to these different projects. May they be coming near your community, near urban center, so you'll have access to more information as well.
Something that I think you could do actively and even right now is to go out and seek Canada's true history, because I think a lot of the conversations we had over this past week were saying that we weren't taught the true history and we weren't taught these things that we have learned over the course of this week. And I think once you know those things, it totally opens up your understanding. And so I think if you go out there and you have to actively seek that information, if you do that, I think that you'll find a greater understanding for Canada's Indigenous people and for the history. And I think you'll understand a lot of respect for Indigenous people and what they've been through.
If you really do have questions about Indigenous people, Indigenous history, just feel free to ask an Indigenous person. We don't bite. We're not going to hurt you. Like, we feel free to share our knowledge. We have no problem sharing our knowledge. We have no problem sharing our history, because all we want to do is educate everyone so that we all have the same mutual understanding of the history between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, but also reconciliation moving forward.
Ouais, je pense de façon générale, soyez curieux. Ayez pas peur de prendre contact. And don't be afraid of getting in touch with different members of different Indigenous communities. Ask questions. I know that there are different people in the Winnipeg region, Francophones, who are also Métis and who can tell you about their own points of view. In Quebec, everywhere in Quebec, it's the same thing. And I think this is important because it will really change your point of view on this issue.
Ways of knowing and different ways of understanding. And if we step back and recognize that it's not just our own way, I think it would be so cool. But nous avons une autre question sur Facebook. Donc,
We have another question on Facebook. Thank you. César Caceres Rojas is asking if it's possible to do cultural exchanges in different cities around Canada and also in reserves and Canadian territories to recognize each other's humanity, develop peace links, and develop the Canadian nation. The youth's engagement, the idea of service and of travel, these are the things that brought me into politics. I was the president of an organization called Katimavik, which was created to bring young people together across the country so that they can visit each other and work together to help communities across the country. As a government, we are working on how to improve the services to youth and improve self-discovery and discovery for all Canadians. So we want to create more opportunities for young people to travel, to learn, and not only through cultural exchanges. I always found that taking one young person and bringing that person to another young person's home is fine, but it's even better if you bring one young person from a community and another young person from another community and bring them to a third community to work together, to learn about each other through work on a common project and through building a better world together. It's extremely powerful, and so I encourage young people to look for opportunities to do that in their studies, in their jobs, during their vacations, their travel. And I would also say the government is looking into ways of encouraging and improving these options. My mother in the 1960s had an interesting experience. She only spoke French. She came from Sainte-Anne-des-Plaines, and she went to a community in Saskatchewan to learn English. And when she was raising me, she often brought up this experience, the fact that it's important to be bilingual. And 38 years later, I'm in charge of youth programs at Canadian Heritage.
I know that back in the day, the Indigenous issue wasn't really on the table. Bilingualism was what was discussed, and the issue of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples is extremely important today, and that is what the Prime Minister is referring to. It goes without saying that we have to take this into account. I think it's possible to improve trust and social cohesion if we are able to build these relationships. Thank you. Thank you for your comments. A program where two people would go to a third community reminded me of the Katimavik program. I'd like to come back to that later, but we have another question.
Stefan Resbrich asks, how do we make a sustained effort for reconciliation? How to move through those uncomfortable moments and not give up?
Perseverance, surely. If you think Indigenous people have faced all these hardships already, all you're doing is just opening up old wounds. I think that's something that needs to happen for all of us to move forward. For us to reconcile as Indigenous people with ourselves, but also for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people to reconcile with each other.
Agree with that comment, and I think we discussed a lot of it within our own group on how reconciliation right now is the buzzword. It's how Elise said it, very sexy. But how do you keep that? How do you make it sustainable? And I think it's going to last because of the resilience of First Nation people across Canada. Indigenous people are extremely resilient and will always fight and will always try to get what they deserve. And so I think when we're talking about reconciliation, there is the general population is interested in being part of that conversation. So it is very optimistic to look at. So I'm very optimistic about it.
But at the same time in the question, we heard that it's going to be hard. There are some really, really painful realities that as Canadians we need to understand and acknowledge and accept a certain amount of responsibility for, not because we were responsible for things that happened generations ago, but because we are now responsible for how the echoes continue in underfunding of Indigenous community, Indigenous education, in continued inequalities in the system, in blind spots that we have because we have an education system that has never properly told the story of our past, of our painful past. And on the Indigenous side, there's going to be challenges in terms of changing, of breaking with habits that have been developed as a defense against a country that has tried, thank God unsuccessfully, to eliminate and assimilate, in some cases has been accepted. And there's going to be a need to take some very, very scary steps together. And the only way we're going to be able to do that effectively is by talking about how difficult it's going to be, by acknowledging the work we have to do, by acknowledging the very real challenges as well. We cannot pretend that there aren't deep set challenges to overcome in the Indigenous community and in the non-Indigenous community. We have to be brave enough to acknowledge, to work together, and to trust that we truly are on this path to reconciliation, while at the same time being patient with each other, because undoing centuries of bad habits built into a system is not going to happen quickly or easily.
And I think to a certain extent, it's a question of trust. I don't think that we are used to trust each other on these issues because there are psychological wounds that are very important. And so that's why in the context very clearly of developing a first legislation, which is I think a huge step ahead in order to preserve Indigenous languages, we need to work all together because we want to have this done. We have a concrete goal all together, Indigenous communities and Indigenous leaders, Indigenous experts. And I think that if we can do that and have this done really, concretely in the next months, this will be a step forward in the context of reconciliation.
I think it's just important to remember, no matter how hard the journey might be, that you don't stop doing something just because it's hard. That just because something's difficult, when you have a worthwhile goal, you can't give up on it. When the going gets tough. So despite all the adversity and despite people that might never see it the way that they should, or despite whatever problems may come in face of reconciliation, that, yeah, it's hard, but you don't stop doing something because it's hard. That's not a reason. That's not an excuse to stop. So.
Yeah, determination and persistence is what I really got from those comments. Thank you. So I know we have another question over here from Facebook. Let's hear what it is.
Donc, Monsieur Trudeau, Aïcha Baldé s'adresse directement.
Aïcha Baldé is asking a question directly to Mr. Trudeau. Mr. Prime Minister, in concrete terms, dialogue, reconciliation, and awareness raising must go through school systems, even though the history of Indigenous peoples plays a very little role in the school system. How can that be improved? I was saying a few days ago that during my own education in the history of Canada, we jumped over the section on Indigenous history because it was less interesting, according to the teacher, as the other parts of history. And I know that that's still the reality. Even some of the members of the Youth Council went through the same thing. We recognize and respect the fact that education is a provincial jurisdiction, but we have to create and make available more tools and information for schools, for education systems, and for learning. At the same time, we also have to value Indigenous history, culture, perspectives, traditional knowledge. We're a country that is full of cultural wealth, and we see that when it comes to multiculturalism, from the multiple perspectives of everyone who came into this country, who had different points of view, different perspectives. But the wealth of knowledge of these indigenous peoples who have lived on this land for millennia has not been truly appreciated as a nation, as a country. We have much more to do, and I think that all levels of government and, of course, schools have a huge job to do when it comes to that. The good news is that there's an openness, there's a desire amongst all Canadians to break the cycle of ignorance and of indifference that has lasted far too long. I think that schools can also build partnerships with different government agencies. For example, the NFB, which makes available on its website a ton of documentaries and websites that have been produced by the NFB and Indigenous producers, or even by non-Indigenous producers, but that have to do with Indigenous issues. I believe CBC Radio Canada can also play a role and fulfill its mandate when it comes to dealing with Indigenous issues without necessarily getting involved in provincial jurisdiction issues. I think that the role of a public broadcaster is to educate the population on the Indigenous perspective, which hasn't necessarily been the case for the last few years. Thank you. We have another question. I'm so happy that you're engaging with us. Sylvia?
Hannah M. Rivard asks, how does mental health and suicide rates fit into the dialogue of reconciliation? What is currently being done and what additional steps can be taken to address such an issue?
In Budget 2017, which just came down a couple of weeks ago, a little more than that now, but we as a government made historic investments in mental health. For the first time, the federal government is investing over $5 billion in mental health over the coming years. A lot of it aimed at young people, and this is going to make a huge difference for all Canadians, but particularly in Indigenous communities where we know there are very real challenges and real issues with whether it's substance abuse, whether it's a missing generation of parenting skills because of residential schools, whether it's deep challenges from a broad range of issues. One of the things that is totally recognized is the role not just of education and opportunities, economic and otherwise, in dealing with issues in Indigenous communities, but the direct link between identity, between culture and language, and how young people feel about themselves in how they're going to be able to succeed and stay away from some of the terrible paths that far too many have been led down. These kinds of things in making real investments is going to make a huge difference, and dealing with mental health issues, dealing with addiction, creating resilience is going to be extremely important through the kinds of language and cultural programming that Mélanie and leaders within the communities are certainly putting at the forefront. Riley?
I think if you're talking about what kind of role does mental health play in reconciliation, it plays a huge role, because how can you ever say that you have achieved reconciliation if there's still 14-year-olds committing suicide, right? So you have to fix those issues and you have to address them before you can fully achieve real, true reconciliation. You have to acknowledge that it's a problem and that the need is understood and that you're going to make effort to fix it, and then beyond that, actually fixing it. And then from that, you'll achieve reconciliation. So not just mental health, there's so many issues, but obviously mental health does then play a huge part in reconciliation, because without fixing mental health issues, you can't achieve it. So.
Thank you. And I know on a personal note, coming from Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, when engaging with the youth who I get to bring their voices to this table, the number one thing that was brought forward, whether they were non-Indigenous or Indigenous, was mental health. So, I mean, it was really awesome to get to go and talk to them and tell them that this investment, this historic investment, was being made. We have a question at Facebook once again. Allez-y.
Donc, nous avons une question de
A question from Adam Aumont-Carpentier is asking if the problem in providing drinking water on reserves will be solved. The answer is yes. We have committed to eliminating all the problems related to providing drinking water within 5 years. For some, 5 years might seem like a long time. We have already started implementing solutions. We've already sent notices to 18 communities, but this can't only be done with Band-Aid solutions. We need to build infrastructure that the community will be able to maintain and pay for and support on the long term. So this is an infrastructure problem, and it's a serious problem that we take seriously. So yes, in the next few years, we will be eliminating all of the advisories when it comes to drinking water. Do you have other answers? Thank you.
To the room for a second. I know you guys, it's been awesome to hear from so many of our fellow youth and everyone's youth in my eyes in Canada. So,
Thank you for that. Simone has a question.
Simone, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm wondering how we can work together on addressing tokenism and cultural appropriation. So yesterday we heard from President Obed about how so many sports teams still have Indigenous mascots, and I think coming from the university community and the equity context at McGill University, we still see people wearing headdresses during Halloween or dealing with those elements of cultural appropriation. So how can we, as a Canadian community, root out these lasting overt expressions of discrimination?
I think that, if I may, I think that the question of cultural appropriation is one that is linked to the respect and knowledge of Indigenous cultures. And that's all about reconciliation. That's exactly what we've been talking in this Facebook, and what you've been talking about for 2 days. And there's a lot of work to be done to that regard. And I understand the frustration on the part of Indigenous people. And I understand, to a certain extent, also the misconceptions that can be also be part of the thinking of non-Indigenous people. And so we need to make sure that that this communication between communities is happening, that this knowledge is shared, and that ultimately that cultural appropriation ceases, and more than that, that the symbols that are so important to communities be celebrated as Indigenous symbols, but also as national symbols.
And I think the key to it is going to be not the heavy hand of government regulation, but of individuals actually expressing themselves, talking to each other, understanding, learning. We've seen society evolve in tremendous ways. What was acceptable 100 years ago or even 50 years ago in so many ways is not acceptable now in many areas. I think respect for Indigenous peoples, Indigenous culture, and avoiding cultural appropriation is a really important conversation to have. But it is a conversation. It is a dialogue. It is an opportunity to learn, to exchange. I think intent matters. I think obviously if someone does something that is deeply offensive, it's not an excuse to say, well, I didn't know, I didn't want to offend. Well, you need to acknowledge that and learn that, okay, whether you wanted to or not, it did. But there can be conversation, there needs to be dialogue about this, about why a traditional name for a sports team that has been there forever is part of the lingering pain and harms that have been so ignored in our past. We cannot move forward in true reconciliation until we do understand why symbols of colonialism and cultural appropriation are still painful to many people today. And that understanding is part and parcel of the healing journey that we all must be on.
Any other comments on cultural appropriation and the use of that, particularly with mascots in universities, or any other thoughts?
It's a really tough subject, and it's something that people don't do on purpose. oftentimes, right? As a white settler, it's something that we do subconsciously without even trying. One of the biggest thing is the appropriation of Inukshuks, right? They're everywhere. How many people know what Inukshuks were meant to be, right? So I think the biggest part of truth and reconciliation is the truth part. So for me, with any kind of appropriation is just finding out more information about it, finding out what the Inukshuk was meant to do. It was meant to guide, by the way. So just learning more can kind of help bridge that gap. Obviously, when it comes to logos and things like that, I think that's done maybe not intentionally at first, but now we know that it is appropriation. And I think Dana made a good point that you should go talk to your community. If the Eskimos is a logo on a hockey team or a soccer team, go talk to that organization and try to get that down.
Thank you. All right, we're going to go around the table another time here, so we'll spin the bottle, and look, we landed over there. Joe Darcel.
I like this game. Okay, thank you very much. I took your advice, some of our panel members, a couple of months ago, actually, and so in Winnipeg, I attended a Canadian Roots Exchange conference. I'm from Winnipeg, so it was a pretty easy sell for me, and then that led me to an engagement with the Indigenous Family Resource Center over on Selkirk Avenue, for those of you who are from Winnipeg, and that in turn led me to a weekly engagement with a political brainstorm group. That's literally the name of it. It's every Saturday morning, by the way, for anybody from Winnipeg. Politics BS, that is what it's called, Politics with an S, and I found that this was actually a very easy conversation to become a part of. One of the reasons for that was because of the terms which were used and the narrative which was broadcast by the people who were running that conversation. And that wasn't me, I was there to learn. One of the key terms that I heard the first time that I showed up was the village, approaching these issues as though we are not members of, say, the Indigenous community, the non-Indigenous community, but rather approaching this as members of the village, recognizing this as a municipal organization. That was very, very important for me in allowing me to engage with these issues in a meaningful way. And I was going to ask some of our panelists here, whether they're in government or not, what of these values, what parts of this vocabulary do you think that we can adopt in a more mainstream political discourse in the interest of being inclusive concerning this subject? Thank you.
Who would like to tackle that one?
You're all looking at me. Well, I think whether you call it village or community, I think one of the things we need to begin to recognize is that we all are part of a community, and the stories we bring, the perspectives we have, the truths that we hold, all are an integral part of that community. And the resilience that we need within our community comes through our sharing of differences and our learning from each other. And not holding anyone up higher or lower than anyone else, understanding the need to listen as much as to speak, understanding the need to learn as much as to share, is, I think, the path that we need to do a better job of walking in politics. I mean, we see all the time how much politics is all too often about confrontation and finger pointing, and there is a really important challenge function in politics. We need to have challenges to the government in order to keep us motivated to do the very best things the very right way, and that's a very important back and forth. But can it be built around a shared respect, a shared sense of we're all trying to build a better future for ourselves, and we may disagree on the details on how to get it, but largely we all agree in the general direction we want to go in. We want better security, better prosperity, better opportunities for everyone who shares this land. And coming back to the idea of community as opposed to different factions or different identities that are in conflict, and understand the value of being good neighbors, I think is a really important aspect of how we move forward. And I love the idea of the village, and certainly look forward to stealing that idea.
Je pense que aussi, Joseph, l'autre point.
I think another interesting point related to this idea of the village that you raised is that every person is allowed their own identity. What I mean is that each person can celebrate their different identities. You come from Manitoba. You probably have a francophone or bilingual history. You have several interests, I imagine. In any case, you can celebrate all of these different identities at the same time. Often, that's not the way we perceive a citizen. A citizen is a concept related to the land where that person lives. But I think that when it comes to tradition and to the conception of citizenship, there are values that may speak to us. There's a history that we share, languages that unite us. But each individual is also allowed to have his or her own individual approach, and we can respect that diversity of identities. I think that that's a part of the way young people have been educated in the last 30 or 40 years, because people define themselves according to the education that they received, the beliefs that they have developed, and it's according to all of that that they're going to participate in their civic lives. So I think this idea of the village is interesting because it allows everyone to address the same topics, but depending on their own identities, especially because we live in a territory called Canada, which means village.
Alors, nous avons une autre question.
We have another question from Facebook. Jimmy Yaya, it's a comment, in fact. He talks about the advantages that would come from learning Indigenous languages for Canadians and immigrants. It's a means of communication that will allow for better knowledge of the other. And he also wishes us good luck. When it comes to Indigenous languages, what we're studying at the moment, there are very interesting concepts related to official languages, such as the vitality of languages. We know that the level of vitality differs depending on the language. We'd like to have an approach depending on each language, the points of view of each community, and respecting the nation-to-nation relationship. And so there are projects that already exist. For example, at Laval University, the Huron language is taught. People can take lessons in the Huron language to learn the language, but also to study other subjects. And so we want someone to learn a language to be able to benefit from learning that language and have employment opportunities because that person speaks that language. We like them to also have access to certain services in that language. So those are issues that we're looking at. Any other comments? Yes?
With language, language is a source of communication. Emotions is a source of communication. Without communication, you can't really relate to each other. Otherwise, we'd all be sitting here in a room just looking at each other. We'd get nothing done. So really, you do need to incorporate Indigenous languages. Max was saying today how someone from a newcomer to Canada spoke better Cree than like 80% of his family. So to me, that's pretty impressive that a newcomer into Canada wants to learn these languages. And when they learn these languages and when they want to learn these languages, I think this opens up new relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. this will allow us to come closer. This will allow us to talk about our differences. This will allow us to talk about our similarities, especially within the language concept. There's there's similarities within every single language as you kind of go across coast to coast. In between the certain regions, there's dialects, which are essentially the same language, just a few tweaks of words and such like that. So essentially, if you think of that, that one language brings that entire greater tribe together, but there could be 4 or 5 tribes under that one tribe that have a few different dialects. So that language and that communication brings people together.
Thank you. I know there's a few councillors who want to ask more questions, but you're going to have to wait. We have another one here on Facebook.
I'm sorry if I butchered that, wants to know what the government is doing to ensure Indigenous youth have equal access to post-secondary education.
We committed to lifting the 2% funding cap that had been in place for a long time, and we are doing that. We know that education is the key to success, to economic success, to relevance, to supporting your family, to supporting your community. We need to make sure that anyone in Canada can access high-quality post-secondary education. It's going to be more and more important. And when you particularly recognize that the proportion of young people in Indigenous communities is higher than the proportion of young people in non-Indigenous communities, particularly with the Census Canada, the Statistics Canada report that we now have more people over the age of 65 than we have under the age of 14, I think it is. We're recognizing that we need to empower every single one of our young people, and making sure that young Indigenous Canadians have full access to educational opportunities right up and beyond post-secondary education is essential, because it's not just about their future, it's about our shared future. That's why specifically there's a PSSP program, which is support for post-secondary education for Indigenous students that we have invested in significantly as we look and work with Indigenous communities and leadership to improve it. There are many opportunities we need to build on in the spirit of reconciliation. So it's not just Ottawa saying, this is how it needs to be, this is how you're going to access post-secondary education. We need to allow Indigenous communities and Indigenous youth and leadership to direct the path and the solutions that they need so they can be properly empowered. And that's a good example of the kinds of challenges we're facing, where we're coming forward wanting to build solutions, but we can't build them because we know solutions from Ottawa have been part of the problem in the past, even when they were well-meaning, and that Indigenous peoples need to be empowered and enabled to direct and construct their own path, their own future, with the government and everyone else supporting this important journey for them, and therefore for all of us.
And that program, the PSSP program, Post-Secondary Student Support Program, it's so exciting that they've lifted that cap after about 15 years, because it means that backlog of students and people who want to pursue it and need that aid can then go forward and do that, and that's going to unlock so much potential in our Indigenous communities. But I'm really happy that's the last question we got to end on. I can't believe an hour's flown by. I'm going to hand the mic over to you, Mr. Prime Minister, and you can take us out.
Thank you. Listen, what an extraordinary pleasure and privilege it always is to sit down with the young people of this Youth Council. The questions you have for us, the knowledge you bring from your communities, from every corner of the country, from your stories, from your background, as we gather together to reflect on the path forward. Over this past few days, we've been focused on a massive issue of reconciliation that touches so much of our lives in so many different ways, whether it's justice or health or culture or everything. that for me, sitting down and working with you is always an extraordinarily humbling learning experience because the perspectives you bring truly challenge us as politicians to keep thinking not on just what we're going to do in the coming years, but what we're going to set in motion that will last for the coming generations. That's always been, for me, at the heart of why engaging and empowering youth in politics is so important. It's not just about getting a few more votes out. It's always been about changing the caliber and the kind of conversations that we have in politics, to challenge ourselves not just to think about the next electoral cycle, but to think about the next 20 years, the next 50 years, the next 100 years. You are at a point in your lives when you are busy creating the rest of your lives with your choices, but you're not just creating the rest of your lives, you're creating the future of this country. And to be able to accompany you in that act of creativity is perhaps one of the greatest pleasures and privileges I have as both Prime Minister and Minister for Youth. Alors, ça a été un grand plaisir de vous recevoir ici.
It's been a great pleasure to welcome you here in Montreal, in my city, and to see how engaged you are and how prepared you are to take up all the challenges of the future when it comes to reconciliation, when it comes to Canada 150, and especially when it comes to the next years that we will be building together. Thank you, everyone. Congratulations.
Oh.